So if you've ever seen anyone doing a hip thrust at the gym, you've probably also seen them using a band around their knees while they're doing it. And today we're going to talk about why you probably shouldn't do that if you want to actually maximize your glute training. So from a structural standpoint, we got the pelvis here, okay, pelvis model, and we're going to talk about the three divisions of the glute, or the three portions. So there's one that attaches to the hip and kind of runs down this way. There's one that attaches to the tailbone, sort of the middle of the tailbone, and runs this way. And then there's one that attaches to the bottom of the tailbone and runs, pretty much horizontally, but also slightly upward. And so if we kind of mapped out what the directions of pull of all of those different fibers would be, they would all be somewhere down and back, right? Because they all kind of wrap around the pelvis. Keep in mind, this is three-dimensional. We're not looking at a 2D textbook and saying, okay, fibers shorten this way and therefore they externally rotate, right? No, they kind of wrap up and around the pelvis when the leg is in front of the body, right? Not out wide, but in front, and they all pull the leg down and back, kind of like in a hip thrusting motion, if your feet were relatively narrow. Now, what happens with putting a band around the knees is, yes, one of the portions of the glute can pull the leg out a little bit, but all of the portions of the glute that are not this top portion actually pull the leg down and in, right? And so those lower fibers of the glute max, which are especially good at pulling the leg down, not only pull the leg down, but also in toward the midline. If you can picture these two sort of points of contact shortening this way, right, that would pull the leg in, and these two portions of the fibers shortening, that would also pull the leg in. Again, the only portion of the glutes that would pull the leg out in any degree would be this one up here. So if you wanted to actually train the lower glutes most specifically, what you would do is you would assume a narrow stance in that hip thrust motion, but you wouldn't want to put a band around the knees, because effectively what the band around the knees does is it's you creating this motion, right? Which is actually, if you think about, pick any one of these two lower portions of the glutes and then pick where they attach over here. If I do this, those things are actually stretching, right? This distance from here to that side of the femur is increasing, right? While this distance over here is decreasing. So again, this upper portion will do some of this work, right? The direct out work, but these two lower guys certainly will not. So if you're doing a hip thrust, or if you're doing any glute max motion, right, where you want to get the most out of glute max and none of the other glutes, like the glute min on the side or the glute med or the TFL or any of those guys, what you would want to do is actually remove the band and just keep the stance narrow, like in a narrow hip thrust where the toes are forward, or in a 45-degree hyperextension where the toes are pretty straightforward. And what you would want to do is just emphasize the down motion, because ultimately the function of the glute max is primarily as a hip extensor. It's not a primary abductor in any sort of plane directly out to the side. So the next time that you do hip thrust, keep your feet narrow, keep them pointed straight forward relative to whatever your structure is. Slightly out is also fine, but make sure that you don't put a band around the knees, because again, this action of pulling the legs outward acts directly against the rest of the motions that the glute produce, which are the main movements that the glute max produces, which is just pulling the leg directly downward.